So today we're going to tackle a topic that I find really fascinating. In fact, it's what my dissertation focused on. But I think it's also a topic that's really important from a policy perspective, and I think is maybe useful for sort of the general population trying to understand sort of what's happening with civil wars and the role the international community plays to be able to evaluate that effectively, to kind of have this conversation and ask this question: does foreign intervention in civil wars actually work? And so we'll just begin with a quick overview of what intervention is. Intervention is the application of power, right? That a state or an NGO or an IGO, usually not an NGO, is going in. They're targeting the authority structures of the state in some way, either bolstering those authority structures or undercutting them by providing support to rebels or others who are trying to take down that state. And that intervention, that pressure on the authority structures of the state is aimed at shaping the conflict, right? So you can't just sort of sanction for any sort of random reason. You're sanctioning or intervening or taking action because you want to affect the course of that conflict. And there's also discussion about intervention being convention breaking. I think I've rambled about that at length at some other point. I don't need to talk about sort of what that gets at. That's more of a in the weeds political science. How do we count this and define this kind of thing? When we're thinking about intervention, interventions can be neutral or they can be biased, right? They can be in favor of the government, they can be in favor of the rebels, or they can sort of nominally not support anybody, but maybe be in favor of or supporting civilians or protecting civilians or some other operation interventions to protect UN forces. In fact, for a number of years, humanitarian intervention was understood solely in the terms of you have your own citizens in that country and you're intervening to get those citizens out. I think today we probably wouldn't think about that as intervention because, again, you're not trying to alter the course of the conflict, but the states get involved for a whole variety of reasons. And we'll talk about that at a later conversation. And so intervention can also, I'll pivot to this question about how it's supposed to work. It can focus on either supporting a negotiated settlement. Sometimes you want to interject a neutral force that does that, right? That essentially forces the parties apart, that prevents them from taking the ground that they would need in order to win, and says, okay, now you need to come to the bargaining table and work this out. Or it can be sort of military focused to alter the military course of a conflict in a way that allows one side to win, right? So maybe there's a stalemate and you intervene to break the stalemate and allow that one of the sides to achieve victory. Or maybe you have one side that is maybe marching forward and you lend military support to speed that side toward victory, right? The focus can be either military victory or it can be focused on pushing parties to the bargaining table. Either way, we would assume that foreign intervention should speed up the duration of conflicts, make them shorter in, I guess, more everyday language. Political scientists talk about duration because our analysis of time is often focused on what are called duration models. And when we run these duration models, what we found is that either intervention doesn't alter the length of the conflict. Sometimes they're longer, sometimes they're shorter, we don't know. Or when it does alter the duration of a conflict, it tends to lengthen those conflicts. And we can slice it a variety of different ways. We can look at neutral conflict or neutral interventions, biased interventions, the type of intervention, military or economic, whether you intervene early in a conflict or late in the conflict. It doesn't really seem to matter if you have foreign actors getting involved in conflicts. The duration of those conflicts seems to go up and not down the way that we would expect. And so when this finding first came out, and I think Patrick Reagan was really central to sort of driving this conversation forward, it set off sort of a panic across the sort of scholars of conflict resolution and civil war, trying to understand why that is, and is that actually correct, and what might account for that, because it appeared that intervention wasn't working. And so I was part of a whole generation of scholarship that really dug into this question to try to parse what exactly is going on when we're thinking about foreign intervention and the consequences of it. And so one explanation for why we're getting the longer duration from intervention, when nominally these interventions should be trying to facilitate conflict resolution in one way or another, whether it's negotiation or military victory. One explanation was just the data is bad. That we picked a set of Civil War cases that were maybe a little bit aberrant, how we're coding the end of conflicts, results in later codings of termination where there's intervention, and earlier codings of termination when there's not intervention, whether that's because of coverage bias, or whether that's because of our coding rules. There's possibly something in our data that's behind this, and so certainly that's part of it. But I think given that this pattern shows up across multiple different data sets, it's hard to make that case that it's all just a bad data problem. A second sort of line of inquiry that people went down is to sort of step back and say, well, interventions aren't happening randomly, right? States or IGOs are choosing to intervene in particular cases. And for whatever reason, that choice tends to favor interventions in conflicts that are really tricky and really hard to resolve. And if you step back and think about this for just a second, that actually makes sense. That if a conflict is relatively straightforward, one side's going to win quickly, or there's an easy negotiated settlement, parties will usually find that negotiated settlement on their own. The conflict will, burn its course and then be over. And there's not really time to mobilize the pressure for an intervention. There's not really time or maybe even need for the United Nations to get involved or for a foreign state to get involved. Just as a logistical matter of a short conflict is difficult to intervene in. We actually saw this in the Rwandan genocide, where there just literally wasn't a way to get international forces on the ground in a large enough number to support the UN peacekeeping force that was there, given the intensity and speed, basically 3 months, 100 days of the genocide. And just the logistical piece of intervention in a short time frame was borderline impossible. But when conflicts drag on for extended periods of time, months upon months into years and decades, there's multiple opportunities for states to get involved, and those are also the conflicts that are maybe the hardest to actually affect and change or alter through intervention. And so we're actually not seeing that intervention is necessarily ineffective, just that we're seeing it happen in conflicts that were already going to go much longer than conflicts where there wasn't intervention. If that maybe helps explain the pattern we're seeing in the data, maybe. A third explanation is that we just need to crack the code and find the magic formula. That sometimes intervention does seem to shorten conflicts, and sometimes it seems to lengthen conflicts. And so if we can maybe parse out what it is about those different interventions, we can figure out why some seem to be effective and shorten the duration, and what are the things that is going on when duration expands and lengthens. Right, maybe we can figure out what that secret formula is. I would say that my research kind of fit somewhat into this story. That I was interested in the role of diplomatic signaling in shaping foreign interventions, and my argument was essentially that you diplomatically signal in advance of a intervention that you're going to intervene. And as a result, when you have sort of laid a long foundation of these signals, you end up with intervention occurring where everybody's decided you're not going to affect things. Whereas if you signal for a shorter period of time and then intervene, maybe you're more likely to be effective. This also kind of ties back into the idea of the hard cases as well. So I was kind of straddling those two different aspects of that sort of explanation for this pattern. I'm not sure that we've actually found a compelling story about how to do intervention right. Every case seems to be a little bit different, has different quirks, and sometimes what we're doing is we're just doing sort of ex post facto rationalization of why something worked in one case versus another case. But I think probably where we've had the most success in actually sort of disentangling this puzzle is to just go back to the foundational question of, like, what's the point of intervention? And we sort of maybe naively began with the assumption that the point of intervention is to stop the killing, to make things end. But that's not always the case, and in fact, that's often not the case at all. Sometimes you get intervention because you want to ensure that one particular side comes out on top. And so you're intervening when your side looks like it's about to lose, which increases the duration. But if it looks like your side is about to win and is on its way to victory, you don't intervene. You just sort of let them achieve their victory, which I guess doesn't increase the duration. And so you're going to only see that intervention when it's going to have the effect of lengthening, stopping a quick victory. against the side that you favor. It might also be that when you get an intervention, it becomes harder to negotiate. That suddenly you have another party who has a vested interest in seeing how that conflict plays out, and now what used to be a two-party negotiation becomes a three-party negotiation, and one of those parties isn't even like a direct in like directly a member of that state. They're outside. They have completely different goals and agendas. They maybe are thinking about a conflict in terms of a larger great power balance, rather than thinking about it in terms of like, what do we need to do to make this conflict resolved and get a functioning state out of it. And so that maybe it's that dynamic that's really making interventions sort of stand out, that we're not actually there to shorten the conflict, we're there to advance our own interests. And in fact, we could go a step further and say that in some situations, maybe the outside intervening state benefits from the conflict continuing, that having an ongoing conflict is actually a good thing for the external actor. We could think about some of Russia's interventions in its periphery, whether it's in Georgia or Ukraine or Nagorno-Karabakh region of Armenia, Azerbaijan. We should probably have looked that detail up. But sort of Russia remains a presence in those conflicts and sort of helps fuel those conflicts and keep them active as a way to retain leverage over its neighbors. It has no interest at all in seeing those conflicts resolved. It has an interest in keeping them going as a tool of foreign policy that it can use. And so I think that this is a useful illustration of sort of how social scientists sort of grind through empirical findings, right? We run the numbers on something that we're not really sure of, a basic but important question. Does intervention work? Does it help shorten conflicts? And we find an answer that seems counterintuitive at first. And then we come at it from a variety of different angles and say, well, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? And we try to isolate down what's the actual mechanism that's driving this pattern. And sometimes we find that there's multiple compelling stories. And sometimes we find that we asked the question the wrong way. Sometimes we find that the data is not exactly what we thought it was. But it's that process of, we posed an interesting question, we got a result that we weren't necessarily anticipating, and then really trying to understand that, and the logic behind that, and the factors driving that. And this is, I think, a useful example of what a sort of a research trajectory or agenda or stream can produce, where we now have a much more nuanced understanding about why we see the patterns that we see.